There are so many trumpet methods out there that determining what's worth owning and what's worth practicing can seem like an impossible task. With so much to practice and so little time, you really can't do everything. So, today I've decided to review a number of well-known trumpet methods and books and give you my honest opinion of each. Let's get into it. I'd like to preface some things before we start discussing different trumpet methods. First of all, I'm only going to be discussing methods that I personally have used. Sorry for you Schlossberg lovers out there, I just haven't personally practiced from that book. It looks great from what I can tell. Number two, if there is a book that I should be checking out, please leave it in the description below. And number three, everything in this video is just my opinion. I'm sure I'm going to have a couple of things that you might consider to be a hot take. That's perfectly fine. We all have our own opinions. Please don't flame me. These are the criteria I'll be using for judging each of these trumpet methods. For each category, I'll be giving each book a score out of 10 for a total possible score of 50. So firstly is variety. Are there a number of different exercises for different purposes? Number two is effectivity. Will practicing out of this book make you a better, more knowledgeable player? Number three is approachability. This really has to do with the general level of the book. Is this the kind of book that a beginner could come into and use for a long time, or is it something that they're going to have to wait until they're an intermediate or advanced player? Number four is interest. Is the book fun, musical, interesting? In a lot of books, the inclusion of some good etudes will make a big difference for this particular category. And number five is usability. My general thought for this category is, can a student use this book on their own, or do they really need a teacher to hold their hand as going through this book? There's some other things that go into this particular category, like is it easy to understand, or do you really have to spend a lot of time reading the text to get it? I thought that it would be best that today we start by discussing some of the most famous general method books for the trumpet. And what better place to start than with the Trumpet Bible itself, the Arban's method. This book is huge. It's pretty much a one-stop shop for trumpet method. It has some great flexibility exercises. It has some great characteristic studies. Even for the more virtuosic trumpet players, it contains the Carnival of Venice and some other similarly styled theme and variations pieces that really show off the possibilities of the trumpet. This book also covers a great deal of levels, and it contains some great duets for use in private lessons. Now, this might be my hottest take of the video. I am not a super big fan of the Arban's book. I think it is too big and has too wide a scope, and I really think for that reason it's best when used with a good private teacher who can show you exactly which exercises and studies are going to be best for you to use in order to improve as a trumpet player. With all that said, this is how I've chosen to rate the Arban's Complete Conservatory method. For variety, because it's such a large book with so much material, I have given it a 10 out of 10. For effectivity, this one was kind of a difficult category for me to decide. I believe that if you have a really good teacher who can show you exactly which exercises and etudes to practice, then it can be incredibly effective. But if you don't have that and are just trying to practice it from front to back, then you're likely not going to get as much effectivity out of it. So I've chosen to rate it somewhere in the middle with an 8 out of 10. In terms of approachability, I do think, so growing up, I had some teachers who talked about the Arban's book who said essentially that it's the kind of book that you could start from day one on page one and just work your way to the back. And by the time you finish it, you're a pro. And as a professional, I now look at this book, and as a professional and a teacher, when I look at the Arban's book, it's pretty clear that to me now that that's not the case, that the beginning of the book is not really usable by beginning students. There are some materials that are usable by beginners, but I would not necessarily call it the most approachable book for that reason. Interest, I think there are some very interesting pieces of this book, some pretty boring pieces, but I think in general, because of the characteristic studies and the theme and variations pieces, I rate it pretty interesting, an 8 out of 10. Usability, this is kind of where the score goes down the most, just because you really have to take a lot of time going through the book and determining exactly what you want to practice from it. I would give it a 6 out of 10. Overall, giving it a 39. Probably the next most famous of the all-in-one general method books is the Saint-Jacome Grand Method. This book is organized into a first and second section. The first section is designed to be usable by beginners, as it says in the intro. As soon as a student is able to reliably play a middle G in the staff, then they should be able to start from the beginning of the first section of this book. Personally, I find that it has an odd combination of advanced concepts with simple music that make it hard to find a target audience for this particular section of the book. Maybe a veteran musician of another instrument who is starting to learn the trumpet could find this first section useful. But also, this first section had some kind of outdated information concerning the use of different crooks and shanks on the trumpet for different transpositions that I don't think are particularly useful for a modern audience. Where I think the Saint-Jacome really shines is in the second volume, starting with its intervallic models. If a student is willing to spend the time in learning to transpose these models, it can really do them a lot of good in terms of their control of the instrument, their flexibility, as well as their knowledge of different key centers. The artistic studies in the book are also really interesting, both from a mechanical and musical perspective. So with all that said, this is how I have chosen to rate the Saint-Jacome. For variety, I have given it a 10 out of 10. Again, this is a very large, complete method. So you can find all kinds of different exercises, so it deserves a 10 out of 10 for that variety. In terms of effectivity, I had a hard time determining how to rate this yet again. That's because this book is divided into two sections. And I think the first section is not very effective for a very large group of musicians, whereas the second group is really effective for more advanced players, starting with the intervallic and scale studies. So for that reason, I've had to give it a middling grade of 7 out of 10. If I was rating the second section on its own, I'm sure I would have given that an 8 or a 9 out of 10. and the first section much lower. Moving on is approachability. Again, because the first section is not really great for beginning students, and the second section is really great for advanced students, I think of this book as really being geared towards advanced students. For that reason, I give it a 6 out of 10 for approachability. Number 4, interest, I gave an 8 out of 10 because I think some of the artistic studies are really satisfying musically, and even a lot of the exercises in the second section are quite satisfying to use. In terms of usability, I've given it a 7 out of 10. It is the kind of book where you generally need to know what you're looking for and knowing what you want to practice. And with all that said, you see that I've given the Saint-Jacome a 39 out of 50, which it means if you're paying attention, I gave it the same score as the Arbans, which maybe is a cop-out, but I do believe that both of these books together can really offer different things and fill in each other's gaps. So I don't really want to rate one better than the other. Moving on, I'd like to talk about Herbert L. Clarke's Technical Studies. This book is the home of one of my favorite of all time exercises, specifically the second exercise from the book. I've practiced that particular exercise in all 12 keys with a number of different scales and harmonic shapes. I've practiced it in inversion and in retrograde and all kinds of stuff. I really love that exercise. Some of the pros of the Clarke's book is that it has very consistently useful exercises. I really don't feel like there is a dud in the entire book. There are also some pretty good etudes. Some of them are a little dry, but they're quite good. I'd say that this book kind of appeals to a wide range, especially if you're willing to practice it quite slow to start. It can really go from early intermediate into advanced trumpet players. And a lot of the studies are very applicable both melodically and harmonically. A lot of the more flexibility-oriented studies you'll see will follow very common harmonic motions like 1-4, 1-5, or those kind of motions that you're going to find fairly often in all kinds of different musics. Just a couple of cons here. I think it's generally very diatonic and maybe sometimes a little bit dry. So this is how I've chosen to rate H.L. Clarke's Technical Studies. For variety, I've given it a 9 out of 10. There's really a lot of great exercises that fulfill a lot of different purposes on the trumpet. I think it's especially impressive given that it is not a very large book. It is a much more compact volume than either the Arbans or Saint-Jacome. Effectivity, 10 out of 10. I think especially that second study, this book is just full of incredibly effective exercises that will make you a better trumpet player. Approachability, I've given an 8 out of 10. It can be a little heavy-handed sometimes, but something that's really nice about it is that everything is written out in all 12 keys. A lot of the studies in the Saint-Jacome that are worth doing, what he does is he models them, and then you're kind of expected to work them out in 12 keys on your own, which is, don't get me wrong, an incredibly good exercise for a trumpet player to do in order to learn how to transpose on the spot. But having everything written out in 12 keys for you really makes it easier to give this book to a more beginning trumpet student. Interest, 7 out of 10. I think that the etudes in this book are really great examples of technical prowess, but I don't find them particularly musically satisfying, so that's why I've given a slightly lower score for interest. Usability, 8 out of 10. I think it's really well organized. Each exercise is quite useful. and usable and easy to see exactly what you're getting from this book. So in total, I've given this book a 42 out of 50, which you notice means I've rated the Clarke's book higher than either the Arbans or the Saint-Jacome. Maybe that's a hot take, but that's okay. Moving on, I'd like to talk about three different very famous flexibilities books. I call these books up and down flexibilities for reasons that we'll get to in just a sec. So to start with, there is the Irons 27 Groups of Exercises, some pros for this particular book. It's good at gradually increasing range and density of the exercises, and is great for developing flexibility through ranges of the trumpet. Some cons: it's almost all entirely moving between partials sequentially, that we're just moving from one partial to the partial right next to it. Next is Walter M. Smith's Lip Flexibilities on the trumpet. Some pros: it gradually increases range and density and is great for developing flexibility through ranges of the trumpet. The cons of this book: it's almost entirely moving between partials sequentially, from one partial to the one right next to it. And finally, we have Colin's Advanced Lip Flexibilities. Some pros: it's gradually increasing range and density, and great for developing flexibility through ranges of the trumpet. Some cons: it's almost entirely moving between partials sequentially. So I'm being a little bit reductive and heavy-handed with making a point here, but the point I want to make is that a lot of the traditional lip flexibilities books for trumpet all really kind of accomplish the same thing. I personally spent the most time with the Smith book, but Colin is probably the most advanced in terms of eventually getting into the most extreme ranges and flexibilities. But other people really love the Irons book as well. But considering they all essentially do the same thing, the point I want to make is that you don't really need all three. You can get one of them and practice from that, and then over time eventually move into the others if you're so inclined. The one problem I do have with these kind of flexibilities books is that we always tend to be moving from one partial into the partial immediately next to it, which doesn't really represent the way that music tends to go, especially when we want to be making some wider, more unexpected intervallic motions. And I think that the next couple books that I'll be discussing are going to help solve some of those problems. Bai-Lin's Lip Flexibilities for all brass instruments is a more recent addition to the trumpet pedagogy, only published in 1996, but I would think of it as a response to the more traditional flexibilities books that we were just talking about. The first lip slurs in this book start in a very modest range of just an octave, but what they do is they kind of go through every possible permutation of notes within a given harmonic series. And for that reason, they create a sense of interval confusion, allowing players to get the kind of flexibility that allows them to play more unexpected lines and phrases. The main problem that I would personally have with this book is that it is very dry. There's pretty much no etudes to be spoken of, and it's pretty much just exercise after exercise after exercise. With that said, I have rated the Bai-Lin book like this. Firstly, in terms of variety, this book does have a lot of different kinds of flexibilities, and they tend to kind of build on each other in a really nice way, but it is a flexibilities book, and it's mostly just exercises with very little in terms of like etudes or other kind of interesting performing content. So for that reason, I've given it a 7 out of 10. In terms of effectivity, I gave it a 10 out of 10. I think this is one of the most effective books for trumpet practice there is. It's one that I use exercises from this book as a part of my daily routine and have for years. Approachability, I think this book is great because since it starts from a very modest range of just an octave, it is something that someone within their first or maybe second year of playing the trumpet could hypothetically start using exercises from this book. So I consider it pretty approachable. Interest, as I was saying before, the musical content in this book is probably the main detractor, in that there is like no etudes or other musical content. So that's why interest gets a 5 out of 10. Usability, I gave a 10 out of 10 because it is a very usable book. It's really easy to find what you want, and going through, you can really clearly see that it's working within different ranges and different intervals, and makes it really easy to understand what's going on in the book. So for that reason, I've given the Bai-Lin Lip Flexibilities for all brass instruments a 42 out of 50. Scott Belk's Modern Flexibilities for Brass is an even more recent addition to the Lip Flexibility catalog, published in 2013, and builds even more on these concepts of lip and interval confusion, but with Belk's own sense of creativity and humor. A lot of the source of this creativity is that rather than relying on exercises that stay within a single harmonic series by using a single fingering, like we are used to with most traditional lip slur exercises, Scott Belk has chosen to make his exercises usually move between one or two different fingerings. The end result being that since we're moving between different harmonic series, it's much more harmonically and melodically interesting. The end result being really satisfying and fun to play exercises, as well as some really good excerpts. The main complaint I would have about this book is that it really does exist for probably intermediate advanced players, and is really not approachable from a beginner perspective. With that said, this is my rating for Scott Belk's Modern Flexibilities for Brass. Firstly, for variety, I've given it a 9 out of 10. There's a huge amount of really useful exercises that all sound super fresh. Secondly, effectivity, I've given it a 10 out of 10. If you're a modern trumpet player who really wants to learn how to move up and down the instrument in really interesting and provocative ways, it's a book I really highly recommend. Approachability, I give an 8 out of 10. As I said before, it is a little bit more on the advanced side, so that's why I give it that rating for approachability. For interest, 10 out of 10. I think this is the most interesting of all of the lip flexibility books that I've played by a fairly wide margin. Super fun, always. And number 5, usability, I give a 9 out of 10 for a total score of 46 out of 50. This is one of my favorite flexibilities books. Moving forward, I'd like to talk about a series of books that I consider to be kind of chop builders, that are made for kind of developing the embouchure and our use of air and general strength and range building. These books tend to use exercises that are kind of outside of the traditional mouthpiece and trumpet on face style of practice. They might incorporate some free buzzing, for instance, or lip bends, or pedal tones, or other such kinds of exercises. The first of these books that I'd like to talk about is Claude Gordon's Systematic Approach to Daily Practice. This book is very well organized with great daily lesson plans. This is a book that I think is really necessary to read the written text of. I know that a lot of people don't like to read the text in their method books, but I think for this one in particular, it is very necessary. This book is great for building range, both up into the stratosphere as high as double C or even higher. At times, the book does just say, go as high as you can. So you can use it for continuing to extend your range as much as you'd like. It also integrates pedal tones, which I think is really, for me personally, one of my favorite ways of working on range is to balance out my range extending with pedal tones in order to make sure that I don't tighten up my chops too much. Some of the cons for this book is it's pretty advanced. It's not really the best for beginners. Secondly, it's somewhat dry and physical. And thirdly, it does at times rely on texts for certain daily practice routines. So for instance, some exercises will say, after you've done this exercise, then do the second set of exercises from H.L. Clarke's book. And so it does rely on a certain amount of knowledge of other trumpet methods. So this is how I've chosen to rate Claude Gordon's Systematic Approach to Daily Practice. For variety, I've given it a 7 out of 10. It can be quite dry, and it is a lot of general, pedal tone exercises followed by range extension exercises. So it's not the most best in terms of variety. Effectivity, I give it a 10 out of 10. I think it is a very effective book. I think all of the exercises that it includes are very helpful for building strength, endurance, and control of the trumpet. Approachability, I give a 7 out of 10. As I said before, it is probably best for a kind of intermediate advanced level student to start this book. Interest, also 7 out of 10. It can be a little dry. There's not really that much in terms of musical material within the book itself. Usability, I give a 9 out of 10 just because I think the formatting of it with each section being another daily practice session is really effective and very easy for people to understand. The only slight problem I have with it is, as I said before, that it will sometimes refer to other methods that then you'll have to be aware of those methods and go to them for completing certain practice routines. Is James Stamp's Warmups and Studies. I think there's a really great book that does a great job of integrating the pedal tone register into the main range of the instrument, which I think is really effective in developing consistency throughout all ranges of the instrument and an ease of play when moving from the low to the high registers and back. I think this book does a great job of building on each lesson, and there's also kind of alternate versions of each lesson as you progress that you can use. There's also kind of aside from those pedal tone exercises, there's some other great exercises that are good for developing range and endurance. I guess my main complaint for this book is that it can be sometimes quite dry, as again, this is more of a true chop builder book, and there isn't much in terms of actual musical etudes or other kinds of practice content. This is how I've chosen to rate James Stamp's warm-ups and studies. For variety, I have given this book a 7 out of 10. It is generally just a book of exercises, and some of them are kind of similar types, so there's not very much variation, but it does really build very well on the exercises that are first introduced in the book. Effectivity, I think it is an incredibly effective book, especially if your goal is to integrate your low and extreme high registers all together. For that reason, I've given it a 10 out of 10 for effectivity. For approachability, I've given this book an 8 out of 10. I use this quite often with my intermediate level students, just as they're learning to play into their pedal tone register. I like to start using this book as a way of getting them to feel through all the ranges of their instrument with ease and effectivity. For interest, I've given this book a 8 out of 10. It is quite interesting. I even consider it sometimes fun, but it is a little dry at moments. And usability, I give a 9 out of 10. I think the structure of the book is pretty easy to see exactly what you want to practice and how to use this book. Next up is Carmine Caruso's musical Calisthenics for brass. If you aren't familiar with the Caruso method, the bread and butter of it is what we call the long setting. The long setting is when the mouthpiece stays in constant contact with the lips, including during rests, which means that generally speaking, when using the long setting, we're going to be breathing through our nose. The end result of the long setting and these exercises is a general development of strength, range, endurance, as well as a balance throughout all ranges of the instrument. Now, these techniques are very physically strenuous, and for that reason have some pretty strict rules about the way that we go about using them. And for that reason, I really think they're best accomplished under the tutelage of a knowledgeable teacher. Having said all that, I do feel a little bit odd about giving a rating to Carmine Caruso's musical Calisthenics for brass, because I think this volume is very specific. It's intended for understanding one thing, which is the Caruso method in general and the long setting, as well as giving kind of the fundamental exercises for using the long setting, which is generally long tones paired with different intervals into steadily increasing ranges. And this, as I said before, accomplishes a great deal in terms of strength and endurance. But with that said, I have chosen to rate it, and for variety, I gave it a fairly low score, 6 out of 10. It is fairly one note. It is just these long setting exercises with a couple other kinds of exercises sprinkled in. Effectivity, I think this is a 10 out of 10 book. The year that I studied with Laurie Frink at New England Conservatory, and was using the Caruso technique exercises, I would say I improved more than the 3 years of personal practice before that. Approachability, I give this a 7 out of 10. This is an advanced book, and it's best done by advanced players. In fact, I think the more advanced you are when you start using it, the more you will improve during the time you use it. Number 4, interest. I gave this book an 8 out of 10. And finally, usability, I gave it a higher score. I gave it a 9 out of 10. That's because the book does a fairly good job of explaining how to use these methods and outlining the rules for using them. But that is assuming that you actually read the text. So please, if you're going to go about using the Carmine Caruso method on your own without a teacher, please make sure you read the text of this book before you start using these exercises. Next, I'd like to discuss Flexus by John McNeill and Laurie Frink. If you aren't familiar with either John McNeill or Laurie Frink, I really highly suggest you check out their works. John McNeill was a fantastic jazz trumpet player who sadly passed away this last September, and Laurie Frink was a student of Carmine Caruso's, and is considered by many to be kind of the next stage in developing of his techniques and methods. And for that reason, it makes sense that the first chapter of Flexus is developments on those long setting exercises that we saw in Carmine Caruso's method. But this book also contains a huge number of different kinds of exercises, many of which are focused on developing a really high level of flexibility throughout the range of the instrument, all ranges of the instrument. There's a number of different kind of calisthenic exercises as well that focus on using lip bends to develop strength and balance on the trumpet. And exercises that are intended for moving between very low and very high ranges very quickly and easily, as well as many different kinds of flexibilities and articulation exercises. I consider this book to be kind of a must-have if you're a modern jazz trumpet player who wants to sound like, let's say, Ambrose Akinmusire. You want to be able to move through all range of the instrument with minimal effort and to be able to play some really unexpected and unique lines. This is really the book. With all that said, this is how I've chosen to rate Flexus by Laurie Frink and John McNeill. For variety, I've given this book a 10 out of 10. It has a huge number of different kinds of exercises to work on just about any skill at the trumpet. Effectivity, it's 10 out of 10. All of the exercises that I've used in this book are incredibly effective at developing strength and range and flexibility. Number 3, for approachability, this is the lowest score I've given for this book, and that's because this is an advanced book. It is definitely not intended for beginners or even lower intermediate players. This book is best tackled by someone who already has a fairly confident understanding of the instrument. For interest, 10 out of 10. There are also some really great, very interesting and quite difficult etudes in this book as well that helps make it much more interesting. And usability, 9 out of 10. It's a very well-organized book. It's really easy to find exactly what you're looking for chapter by chapter. Finally, this last text is one that I don't believe has ever been officially published or ever could be, but is a really fantastic resource for any serious brass player. This is An Integrated Warmup by Lori Frink. If you've never heard of it, I suggest you Google it, and you should be able to find a PDF copy, no problem. An Integrated Warmup by Lori Frink is a compilation of exercises from a number of different methods that put together create a well-balanced practice routine. It includes a number of long setting exercises that Lori wrote herself, as well as exercises from Clarke's, Sikowitz, and Bai-Lin. This is how I've chosen to rate An Integrated Warmup by Lori Frink. For variety, I have given it a 9 out of 10. It's very varied because it contains a number of different materials from a number of different resources. Effectivity, a 10 out of 10. I think that it contains some of the most effective exercises for building on strength, endurance, range, flexibility, what have you. Approachability, I give this book an 8 out of 10. I think it's doable from a pretty intermediate level to start using this text. Interest, 9 out of 10, because, again, it comes from a number of different resources. It makes it much more interesting. And usability, 10 out of 10. It's really well organized. Each section of the book is broken up into slightly different ranges of the instrument, kind of partial by partial. So it's really quite easy to use. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope I haven't offended anyone with my opinions on any of these texts. If you would like to respectfully disagree with any of my opinions, please feel free to do that in the comments below. Also, if you're interested in learning more about any of these methods, I do offer private lessons. There's a link to my website where there's a contact form in the description below. Also, if you want to see more of my content about jazz improvisation or trumpet, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much, and happy practicing.